Reynolds didn't answer right away. He glanced at the older officer, who shifted uncomfortably before exhaling. "That's the part we don't know," he admitted. "But what we do know is that Marcus Hale wasn't out there by accident today." Carter's mind reeled. "So, what? You think I'm the reason he was there?" Reynolds tapped his fingers against his desk. "He wasn't going to arrest you, Carter. He was watching you. And now, after what happened today, you were officially on their radar." A sharp knock at the door made them all turn. Before anyone could respond, the door pushed open, and in walked Marcus Hale. No cuffs, no suit this time, just a quiet, calculating presence that made the air in the room feel 10 degrees colder. Carter stiffened, but Reynolds raised a hand, signaling her to stay silent. Marcus walked to the desk, his eyes locked on Carter. Then, in a slow, measured tone, he said, "You're in danger." Carter frowned. "From who?" He tossed another folder onto the desk. It slid open, revealing more photos. Not just of her, but of the police station, her apartment, even the coffee shop she stopped at every morning. Carter's pulse pounded. "Who's doing this?" Marcus crossed his arms. "We were hoping you could tell us." She blinked. "Me? I don't know anything about this." Marcus held her gaze. "Someone does." He turned to Reynolds. "Has anyone unusual been asking about her? Any sudden interest in her work, her assignments?" Reynolds exchanged a look with the older officer. "Not that we know of, but we can check." Marcus nodded, then looked back at Carter. "Who have you been around lately? Anyone new? Someone acting different?" Carter opened her mouth, but then it hit her. A sinking realization that sent a chill down her spine. Last week, the new guy at the station, Officer Daniels. She had barely paid attention to him, but now her mind raced back. The way he had asked casual questions about her patrol routes. How he had been outside on his phone when she left work, not once, but twice at the time, it had seemed harmless. But now? Carter swallowed hard. "There's a new officer," she said slowly. "Daniels. He started last week." Marcus didn't react much, but she could tell he was filing the information away. "Where is he now?" he asked. Reynolds grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, locate Officer Daniels." Before he could finish, a loud crash echoed from outside. The station's front doors slammed open, followed by rapid footsteps. A voice shouted, "Gun." Carter barely had time to react before Marcus moved. In a flash, he reached for his weapon, his entire body shifting into fight mode. Reynolds dove toward his desk. Carter lunged toward the door. And then silence. The room was eerily still. No gunfire, no chaos, just the heavy weight of anticipation. Then a voice, low, steady, and way too calm, spoke from the hallway. "Officer Carter." She turned slowly, and there he was. Daniels, standing just a few feet away, his hands raised, but his eyes locked directly on her. "I think we need to talk," he said, a small, knowing smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. And that was when Carter realized this wasn't over, not even close. Carter's breath was steady, but every muscle in her body was tense as she locked eyes with Daniels. The station was eerily quiet now, every officer on edge, waiting. Marcus Hale hadn't lowered his gun, and Reynolds was watching closely, his hand hovering near his own weapon. But Daniels, he just stood there, hands up calm, like he had already won. "What do you want?" Carter asked, her voice even. Daniels tilted his head slightly, studying her. Then slowly, he dropped his hands. No one moved. "You've been asking the wrong questions," he said, his tone casual, almost amused. "You think I'm the one watching you, tracking you." He let out a small chuckle. "You have no idea who's really behind this." Carter's fingers twitched at her side. "Then why didn't you tell me?" Daniels glanced at Marcus. "I think he already knows." Marcus didn't react, but Carter could see the shift in his posture. He was putting the pieces together, and whatever answer he had found, he wasn't sharing it. Reynolds stepped forward, his patience gone. "Enough games, Daniels. What are you doing here?" Daniels exhaled and looked around, like he was debating whether to say more. Then finally he spoke. "You're all focused on me, but I'm not your problem." His gaze flicked back to Carter. "You are." A chill ran through her. What does that mean? She turned back to the man she had detained, watching as he finally stepped away from the scene. People in the crowd still lingered, waiting, hoping for some dramatic ending. But there wasn't one, at least not yet. As Carter stood there, her radio crackled. "Officer Carter, report back to the station immediately." Her breath hitched. They knew. Someone had made a call. Maybe the suited man. Maybe the man she had cuffed. Maybe someone else entirely. She swallowed hard and glanced at the older officer again, hoping for some kind of reassurance. But he wasn't looking at her anymore. His attention was on the suited man, who was now watching them with quiet intensity. Carter turned back toward her patrol car, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She could feel it now, the shift in the air. This wasn't just about an arrest gone wrong. This was bigger. As she reached for her car door, she heard the suited man's voice one last time, spoken just loud enough to reach her. "We're not done, Officer Carter." Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't know what was coming next, but one thing was clear. Her life was about to change in ways she never saw coming. Carter gripped the steering wheel tighter than she needed to as she drove back to the station, her pulse still racing. The suited man's words echoed in her head. "We're not done, Officer Carter." She had heard threats before, veiled warnings from suspects who were angry about being caught. But this felt different. This wasn't just about an arrest. It was something bigger, something she didn't understand yet. When she pulled into the station, she barely had time to take a breath before she was called into the captain's office. The older officer from the scene was already inside, standing near the door with his arms crossed. Carter could tell from his expression that this was bad. Captain Reynolds sat behind his desk, his expression unreadable. He was a man who had been on the force for decades, someone who had seen it all. But the way he looked at her now, that was new. "Sit down," he said. Carter did, trying to keep her face neutral even though her heart was hammering. The captain sighed and leaned forward. "Do you have any idea who that man was?" Carter swallowed. "I was hoping someone would finally tell me." Reynolds exchanged a glance with the older officer before turning his attention back to her. "His name is Marcus Hale." The name meant nothing to her. She kept her expression blank. The captain exhaled through his nose. "You really don't know, do you?" He shook his head. "Marcus Hale is not just some guy walking down the street. He's a federal investigator." Carter's breath caught. "A Fed?" Reynolds nodded. "Not just any Fed. He works deep in high-profile cases, undercover operations, things way above our pay grade. And you put him in cuffs on a public street in broad daylight." Carter felt the blood drain from her face. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a disaster. Before she could respond, Reynolds continued. "And the man in the suit, that was his handler. Someone even higher up." He leaned back. "They weren't just out for a stroll, Carter. They were in the middle of something." Carter's stomach twisted. "I didn't know." "You should have," the older officer muttered. She turned to him. "I was doing my job. I saw something that didn't look right." Reynolds gave a humorless chuckle. "Well, now they think something doesn't look right. You." He tapped his desk. "We got a call not even 10 minutes after you left the scene. No official complaints. Yet. But let me be clear, Carter, you're on thin ice." Carter clenched her jaw. "So what now?" Reynolds studied her for a long moment. Then, instead of answering, he reached into a drawer and pulled out a sealed folder. He slid it across the desk. Carter hesitated before picking it up. As soon as she opened it, her breath caught. Inside was a surveillance photo, a grainy image taken from a security camera. But what made her blood run cold, what made her fingers tighten around the edge of the folder, was that the photo wasn't of Marcus Hale. It was of *her*, taken just days ago. The captain watched her reaction closely. "They knew who you were before today," he said quietly, "which means you weren't just in the wrong place at the wrong time." Carter felt the room closing in. She looked up at Reynolds, her voice barely above a whisper. "What the hell is going on?" Carter's hands felt clammy as she stared at the surveillance photo. The grainy image showed her walking to her car, completely unaware she was being watched. Someone had been following her, tracking her. But why? She looked up at Captain Reynolds, her voice tight. "Who took this?" The officer's stomach dropped. She had just made the biggest mistake of her career, and she didn't even know how bad it was yet. The officer's grip on the cuffs loosened slightly, but she didn't release them. She could feel the weight of the crowd's eyes on her, the silent judgment from the man in the suit, and the unwavering patience of the man she had detained. Her mind raced through possible scenarios. Had she detained a politician, a high-ranking official, a fellow officer undercover? Every answer seemed worse than the last. The man in the suit exhaled, his gaze locked onto hers. "You're going to want to take those cuffs off," he said, his voice even, but there was something in it. A warning. The officer hesitated. She had been trained to trust her instincts, to stay in control of the situation. But for the first time, she wasn't sure if she was the one in charge anymore. She had acted fast, maybe too fast. And now she was standing in front of someone she clearly should have recognized. The man in cuffs finally spoke. "What's your name, officer?" His voice was calm, but there was a quiet authority behind it. She swallowed. "Officer Carter," she said quickly, her voice sharper than she intended. He nodded slightly, as if filing that information away. "And what exactly am I being arrested for?" Her throat tightened. She knew she had no real answer. She had seen him walking, had made a snap judgment, and now she was standing in a situation spiraling out of her control. She couldn't admit that. Not here. Not in front of all these people, not with cameras still recording. A police car pulled up to the scene, its lights flashing, though no siren sounded. Another officer stepped out, older, more experienced. His expression shifted the second he saw who was in cuffs. His face went pale, and then tight with worry. He hurried toward them, eyes darting between Officer Carter, the man in cuffs, and the man in the suit. "Carter," he said, voice low but urgent, "what are you doing?" "I was just—" she started, but he cut her off with a sharp shake of his head. "Take the cuffs off," he ordered, his voice leaving no room for argument. Officer Carter's stomach dropped. She glanced at the man she had arrested, still unreadable, still waiting. Slowly, she reached for the key and unlocked the cuffs. The moment they clicked open, the man rubbed his wrists slightly but didn't look at her. He looked at the older officer instead. "This how your department operates now?" he asked coolly. The older officer let out a slow breath. "I am so sorry," he said, his voice filled with something Carter couldn't quite place. "Fear? Regret? We had no idea." "No idea about what?" Carter's chest tightened. The man in cuffs finally turned back to her, meeting her eyes directly for the first time. "We'll talk soon, Officer Carter." And just like that, the situation was over. Or so it seemed, but something told her this was only the beginning. Officer Carter stood frozen, her mind spinning as the man she had just uncuffed adjusted his sleeves and turned to walk away. The crowd was still watching, some whispering, others recording as if they knew this wasn't over. The older officer who had arrived pulled her aside, his grip firm on her arm. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" he muttered under his breath, his face tight with frustration. Carter shook her head, her pride refusing to let her admit she was completely lost. "I was doing my job," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. He was acting suspicious. No, the older officer cut in sharply. He wasn't. Carter clenched her jaw. Then who is he? The older officer exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face like he was deciding whether to even tell her. Then, in a voice low enough that only she could hear, he said, "That man is not someone you want to mess with, and neither is the person who stepped in." Her stomach twisted. The man in the suit, the one who had commanded the entire situation with just a few words. Carter turned her head slightly, catching a glimpse of him speaking quietly to the man she had arrested, or rather, the man she had tried to arrest. Whatever they were saying, it wasn't for anyone else to hear. Then, as if feeling her gaze, the suited man glanced in her direction. His expression was unreadable, but there was something unsettling about it. He didn't look angry. He looked like someone who had just seen something he expected. Carter's pulse quickened. "What do I do?" she asked, barely above a whisper. The older officer looked at her, his expression serious. "Pray this doesn't go any further." But something told her it already had. It all started on a quiet afternoon, just like any other. The streets were buzzing with people going about their day, some heading to work, others grabbing coffee or catching up with friends. But in the middle of it all, something was about to happen that would change everything. A white female police officer, young and confident in her uniform, patrolled the area. At first glance, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But then her eyes locked onto a black man walking down the sidewalk, minding his own business. Without warning, she made her move. "Excuse me, sir," she called out, her voice firm but controlled. The man turned, confused but polite. He had no idea why he was being stopped. He wasn't causing trouble, wasn't acting suspicious, just walking. But within seconds, the situation escalated. The officer began questioning him aggressively, demanding to see his ID, asking where he was going and why. The man, still calm, asked a simple question: "Am I being detained?" That seemed to set her off. Before he knew it, she grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back. "You're under arrest," she snapped, reaching for her cuffs. Passers-by slowed down, some pulling out their phones, sensing that something wasn't right. The man tried to reason with her. "For what? I didn't do anything." But she wasn't listening. What happened next left everyone speechless. As the officer struggled to restrain him, another voice cut through the tension. A deep, commanding voice, one that made the officer freeze in place. "Let him go," the voice said. The crowd turned, and in that moment, the entire situation took a shocking turn. Because the man she was unlawfully arresting wasn't just anyone. He was someone she never should have messed with. And the truth was about to come out in a way that no one expected. What happens next? Stay tuned to find out. The officer turned sharply, her grip still tight on the man's arm. Her heart pounded as she scanned the crowd, searching for the source of the voice. A tall man in a dark suit stepped forward, his face calm but serious. His presence alone commanded attention. The people around them whispered, sensing that something bigger was at play. "Let him go," the man repeated, his tone firmer this time. The officer hesitated. She was trained to handle difficult situations, but something about this man unsettled her. He wasn't just another bystander standing up for a stranger. There was authority in his voice, something that made her question if she had just made a huge mistake. The man she was arresting, who barely spoke as she tightened the cuffs around his wrists, finally looked up at the suited figure. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet confidence that made it clear he knew exactly what was happening. He wasn't scared. He wasn't confused anymore. He was waiting. "Sir, this is a police matter," the officer said, her voice steady but her grip slightly loosening. "I need you to step back." The man in the suit didn't move. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulling out something small but unmistakable, a badge. The officer's breath hitched. The crowd reacted first. A few gasps, a couple of murmurs. Some people exchanged looks, phones still recording, sensing that this situation had just taken a dramatic turn. The officer's mind raced as she processed what was happening. This wasn't some random man off the street. This wasn't just anyone. The black man she had just forced into cuffs, right there in front of dozens of witnesses, was someone with power. Someone important. But who? The officer's pulse quickened. She had followed her instincts, or at least she thought she had. She believed she was doing her job. But now doubt crept in. Had she overstepped? Had she made a mistake she couldn't take back? The suited man took a step closer. "Officer," he said, his voice lower now, almost challenging. "Do you know who you're arresting?" The crowd fell completely silent. The officer blinked, looking at the man she had detained. He still hadn't said much. He was letting everything unfold, watching her closely, measuring her every reaction. There was no anger in his face, no panic, just patience. He was waiting for her to figure it out. Her fingers twitched near her radio. Maybe she should call it in, get backup. But something told her that wouldn't help. She swallowed hard. "Who is he?" she asked, trying to sound in control. But her voice was different now, less certain, less sure. The suited man exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "You should have asked that before we put the cuffs on." Daniels gave her one last look before turning his attention to Marcus. "You should tell her." Before Carter could press for more, another officer stepped in, gun drawn. "Daniels, hands behind your back. Now." Daniels didn't resist. He just smiled, like this was all part of the plan. As they cuffed him and led him away, he didn't struggle, didn't argue. He simply leaned in and whispered something to the officer escorting him. Carter couldn't hear it, but she saw the officer's face pale slightly. Then, just like that, Daniels was gone. The tension in the room didn't lift. Carter turned to Marcus, her patience wearing thin. What was he talking about? What aren't you telling me? Marcus studied her for a long moment before finally sighing. "You were never just some random officer, Carter." He nodded toward the surveillance photos. "Whoever's behind this, they were watching you asterisk before asterisk you ever crossed my path." Carter's stomach twisted. "Why?" Marcus hesitated, then finally said, "Because you're connected to something bigger, something you don't remember." Her pulse pounded. "What do you mean? I don't remember." Marcus didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled a small flash drive from his pocket and placed it in her hand. "Find out for yourself." Carter stared at it, her heart racing. Whatever was on this drive, whatever truth was waiting, she wasn't sure she was ready for it. But something told her she didn't have a choice.